On the unforgiving frontier of 1870s New Mexico, Thomas Whitmore saw his daughter's unusual height as a curse upon his family name. At 17, Rebecca stood nearly 6 feet tall, towering over every man in their settlement and drawing whispers of shame that followed Thomas through the dusty streets. When Apache warriors arrived seeking trade, Thomas made a decision that would haunt him forever. He offered his daughter in exchange for horses and supplies, believing he was ridding himself of an embarrassment. But the Apache saw something Thomas never could. In their ancient legends, a tall woman with eyes like winter sky would come to their people as a sacred messenger. Rebecca's height wasn't a flaw, it was divine prophecy fulfilled. As she discovered her worth among people who revered rather than rejected her, one question remained unanswered. Could a daughter's heart ever forgive the father who saw her as nothing more than damaged goods to be traded away? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Whitmore had always been different, but it wasn't until her 13th birthday that she understood difference could be a burden. Standing beside the wooden measuring stick her mother kept near the kitchen door, she watched the pencil mark climb higher than any girl her age should reach. Her mother, Sarah, tried to smile as she made the mark, but Rebecca caught the worry flickering in her eyes. "You're growing into a fine young woman," Sarah had whispered, but her voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. The measuring stick, carved from oak by Rebecca's grandfather, bore the growth marks of 3 generations. Neat pencil lines tracked the progress of cousins and siblings, each mark a celebration of healthy development. But Rebecca's marks told a different story, one of relentless upward movement that seemed to have no natural stopping point. By 14, she stood taller than her father. By 15, she could look down on every man in their settlement of Cedar Ridge. The measuring stick became a source of dread rather than pride, each new mark evidence of her increasing separation from normalcy. Her mother tried to shield her from the whispers, but small settlements keep no secrets. Women gossiped over their washing, speculating about what could cause such unnatural growth. Some blamed bad blood, others whispered about curses or divine punishment for unnamed sins. "Perhaps she'll find her place when she's older," Sarah would tell Thomas during their evening conversations, her voice growing more desperate with each passing month. Thomas said little during those discussions, but Rebecca noticed how his jaw tightened whenever her height became the topic. She learned to recognize the look that crossed his face when neighbors commented on her stature, a mixture of embarrassment and resignation that cut deeper than any cruel words. The worst part wasn't the staring or the whispers, it was the way opportunity closed before her, like shutters against a storm. Other girls her age learned domestic skills alongside dreams of marriage and family. Rebecca learned the same skills but understood they would likely serve no greater purpose than managing her father's household indefinitely. Young men who might have courted shorter girls found excuses to avoid Rebecca's presence. At community gatherings, she watched her peers dance while she sat with the older women, her height making her an awkward partner for any potential suitor. The few brave souls who approached her did so with the air of men accepting a dare rather than genuine interest. Her mother's death from fever during Rebecca's 16th winter changed everything. Sarah's gentle protection vanished, leaving Rebecca exposed to her father's growing resentment. Without his wife's mediating presence, Thomas no longer bothered hiding his disappointment in the daughter fate had given him. The measuring stick remained by the kitchen door, but no one made marks on it anymore. Rebecca had stopped growing, but the damage was done. At nearly 6 feet tall, she stood as a constant reminder of Thomas's failed hopes for a normal family life. "Your mother spoiled you," Thomas began saying, during their increasingly tense meals. "Made you think being different was something to celebrate, instead of something to fix." Rebecca wanted to defend her mother's memory, but she understood the futility of argument. Thomas had convinced himself that Sarah's gentle acceptance had somehow caused Rebecca's unusual height, as if love could be blamed for the mysteries of human growth. The settlement's attitude shifted after Sarah's death as well. Without her mother's social standing to provide protection, Rebecca became fair game for more open criticism. Women who had whispered behind hands now spoke freely about the unnaturalness of her stature. Men who had shown grudging respect for Sarah's daughter now treated Rebecca with the uncomfortable mixture of fascination and revulsion reserved for curiosities. "It's not right," she heard Mrs. Henderson tell her neighbor one morning. "A woman shouldn't tower over God's creation like that. Makes the whole settlement look cursed." Rebecca tried to make herself smaller, hunching her shoulders and avoiding eye contact when she walked through town. But there was no hiding 6 feet of height, no way to apologize for occupying more space than society deemed appropriate for a woman. The measuring stick stood silent witness to her isolation, its pencil marks now resembling a ladder she had climbed beyond everyone's reach. Some nights, alone in the kitchen, Rebecca would stand beside it and remember her mother's gentle voice explaining that growth was natural, that height was simply another way God made people unique. But those memories felt increasingly fragile against the weight of daily rejection. Rebecca began to wonder if her father was right, if her unusual stature truly was a curse that had brought misfortune to their family. The question tormented her during long nights, when sleep provided no escape from the burden of being different in a world that demanded conformity. The brass nameplate on the third pew from the front had read Whitmore family for as long as anyone could remember. Thomas's father had paid good money for that reserved seating, establishing the family's respectable position in Cedar Ridge's social hierarchy. But on recent Sundays the pew sat empty, its polished brass reflecting light onto vacant wooden seats. Thomas couldn't bear the stairs anymore. Every Sunday service had become an endurance test, with Rebecca's towering figure drawing attention like a lighthouse beacon. When she stood for hymns, her head rose above every other congregant, creating an unavoidable spectacle that made Thomas's skin crawl with embarrassment. Perhaps Rebecca could sit during the singing. Reverend Matthews had suggested gently after one particularly uncomfortable service. The well-meaning pastor's words stung worse than open criticism, confirming Thomas's fears that his daughter's presence disrupted even sacred worship. The final straw came during the Harvest Festival social. Rebecca had worn her best dress, a blue cotton garment that Sarah had sewn before her death. The fabric hung properly, but no amount of skilled tailoring could disguise the fact that Rebecca's frame required considerations no seamstress should have to make. The whispers followed Thomas through his daily business dealings. His grain storage contracts suffered as farmers found excuses to work with other merchants. The bank delayed approving his loan extension, citing concerns about his family's situation affecting his judgment. Even simple transactions at the general store became exercises in social navigation, with customers timing their visits to avoid encountering the Whitmore family. "Your daughter's situation is affecting the whole community's reputation," Mayor Caldwell informed Thomas during a private meeting. "Perhaps you should consider other arrangements." Other arrangements. The phrase haunted Thomas during sleepless nights. What arrangements existed for a daughter whose very presence had become a liability? No man would marry her. No respectable family would take her as hired help. The few options available were either charity cases or solutions that involved sending Rebecca far away from everything she had ever known. Thomas began avoiding social situations entirely, conducting business through intermediaries when possible. He stopped attending town council meetings where his input had once been valued. The family's social standing crumbled like a poorly maintained building, each day bringing new evidence of their fall from respectability. Rebecca seemed to understand her role in the family's decline without needing explanation. She rarely spoke during meals, moving through the house like a ghost, haunting rooms that had once echoed with her mother's laughter. Thomas caught her staring out windows with an expression that suggested she was calculating distances to places where her height might not matter. "I could leave," she offered one evening, her voice barely audible above the crackling fireplace. "And go where?" Thomas replied, his tone harsher than intended. "What decent place would take a woman like you?" The cruelty of his words hung between them like smoke, poisoning the air with truths neither wanted to acknowledge. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed, and Thomas felt the familiar mixture of guilt and resentment that had become his constant companion. The brass nameplate remained on the empty pew, a monument to the family's former standing. Other families moved forward to claim better seating, but no one requested the Whitmore pew. It had become tainted by association, a reminder of how quickly respectability could vanish when a family failed to conform to community expectations. Thomas's business continued its slow decline. Contracts went to competitors who didn't carry the burden of an age-appropriate daughter. Social invitations ceased arriving. The carefully constructed life he had built through decades of hard work was dissolving because he had failed to produce a daughter who fit society's narrow definitions of acceptable womanhood. Late at night, Thomas stared at the brass nameplate he had removed from the church pew and brought home as evidence of his fall from grace. The polished metal reflected his candlelight like tears, reminding him that some mistakes could never be undone, only endured until a solution presented itself. The solution, when it came, would test every principle Thomas thought he possessed about family loyalty and the lengths a desperate man might go to reclaim his standing in a community that had turned its back on him. The Apache riders appeared on the horizon, like mirages materializing from heat shimmer, their silhouettes wavering against the endless blue sky of late summer. Thomas spotted them first from his position near the grain storage shed, shading his eyes with a calloused hand as he counted their numbers. 8 riders, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who belonged to this harsh landscape in ways settlers never would. Word spread quickly through Cedar Ridge, carried by children who ran between houses, shouting news of the approaching band. Women gathered their laundry and called their children inside, while men emerged from shops and homes to assess the situation. Apache visits were rare but not unprecedented. These were trading encounters, governed by unspoken protocols that had kept peace in the region for nearly a decade. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, but not from fear. Opportunity rode with those 8 warriors, possibility disguised as potential danger. He had been expecting this moment, praying for it during long nights when the weight of his social exile pressed against his chest like a physical burden. The Apache leader was a man of perhaps 40 years, his face weathered by sun and wind into the texture of well-worn leather. He sat his horse with the natural grace of someone born to the saddle, his eyes taking in every detail of the settlement with the calculating assessment of an experienced trader. A ceremonial peace pipe hung from his belt, its carved bone surface decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of spiritual significance beyond Thomas's understanding. "We seek trade," the leader announced in careful English, his accent lending formality to the simple words. "Good horses for good goods." Mayor Caldwell stepped forward as the settlement's unofficial negotiator, his nervous energy contrasting sharply with the Apache leader's calm presence. Behind him, other townsmen gathered in a loose semicircle, their rifles visible but not openly threatening. The ritual of frontier commerce required this delicate balance between readiness and respect. "What goods do you offer?" Caldwell asked, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of a man determined to appear confident. The Apache gestured toward pack animals laden with buffalo hides, beadwork and silver jewelry crafted with skills that surpassed anything the settlement's blacksmith could produce. Thomas's attention focused on their horses, magnificent animals, with the lean strength that came from generations of careful breeding and harsh living conditions. "We need horses," Thomas found himself saying, stepping closer to the group despite having no official role in the negotiations. "Strong horses for heavy work." The Apache leader's dark eyes settled on Thomas with interest. There was something in that gaze that seemed to see beyond surface appearances, to evaluate character and intention with the penetrating insight of someone accustomed to reading men's souls in their faces. "You have need of horses?" the leader asked, directing his question specifically to Thomas, rather than Mayor Caldwell. "My farm requires better stock," Thomas replied, his mind racing ahead to possibilities he barely dared consider. "I have things to trade." The other settlers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Thomas was overstepping established protocols. But the Apache leader seemed intrigued by this direct approach, nodding slowly as if appreciating honesty over diplomatic circumlocution. "What things?" the leader asked. Thomas felt the moment crystallizing around him like water freezing into ice. Every choice he had made, every humiliation he had endured, every sleepless night spent calculating his family's diminishing options, had led to this instant when desperate need met unexpected opportunity. "Perhaps we could speak privately," Thomas suggested, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. The Apache leader considered this request with the gravity of someone weighing spiritual matters alongside practical concerns. The peace pipe at his belt caught afternoon sunlight, its decorated surface seeming to glow with inner fire. "I am called Stone Bear," the leader said finally. "We will speak." The other settlers watched nervously as Thomas led Stone Bear away from the main group, their conversation moving toward Thomas's property, where privacy would allow for the kind of discussion that could not happen under public scrutiny. Rebecca remained inside the house, as Thomas had instructed, but he could feel her presence behind curtained windows, like a weight pressing against his conscience. Stone Bear walked with the measured steps of someone accustomed to considering each decision carefully, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed Thomas's modest holdings. The peace pipe remained at his belt, a constant reminder that this encounter balanced on the edge between commerce and something far more significant. The transaction occurred in the shadow of Thomas's barn, away from the settlement's curious eyes. Stone Bear stood with his back to the setting sun, his weathered face impossible to read, as Thomas struggled to find words for what he was proposing. "My daughter," Thomas began, then stopped, his throat constricting around the words. "She is unusual." Stone Bear waited in silence, his dark eyes patient but alert. The peace pipe remained at his belt, its carved surface catching the last rays of daylight like a talisman weighing the moral balance of their conversation. "She brings shame to my family," Thomas continued, hating the sound of his own voice. "Her height, it's not natural for a woman. The settlement considers her cursed." Still Stone Bear said nothing, but his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to sounds Thomas could not hear. "I need those horses." Thomas pressed on, desperation making him bold. "Good horses could restore my standing, help me rebuild what I've lost." In exchange, the words hung between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas gestured toward the house, where Rebecca waited, unaware that her fate was being negotiated, like livestock at market. Stone Bear's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that suggested the conversation had taken an unexpected turn toward matters of significance. "Show me," Stone Bear said simply. "Tell me," Stone said simply. Thomas felt his stomach lurch. There was no retreating from this precipice, no way to unsay what had already been spoken. He walked to the house with Stone Bear following each step, feeling like a betrayal of every principle he had once claimed to hold betrayal of a betrayal of unforgiving he had once claimed to hold secret. "Rebecca," Thomas called through the door. "Come outside." She emerged wearing the blue dress. The blue dress. Serve us soon. Her face was in the fabric with luminous energy. When she saw Stone, her eyes widened with surprise, but she maintained the composed demeanor her mother had taught her. The effect on Stone Bear was immediate and profound. His entire bearing changed, shoulders squaring as if he had suddenly recognized something of great importance. His eyes moved from Rebecca's face to her unusual height, taking in every detail with an intensity that made Thomas uncomfortable. Rebecca stood uncertainly, clearly sensing the weight of the moment without understanding its implications. Stone Bear circled her slowly, his movements deliberate and reverent, as if he were examining a sacred artifact rather than a human being. "She is the one," Stone Bear said finally, his voice carrying a note of awe that Thomas had not expected. "The one what?" Thomas asked, confused by the Apache's reaction. Stone Bear reached into his leather pouch and withdrew a bracelet of turquoise and silver, its craftsmanship speaking of deep cultural significance. Without hesitation, he approached Rebecca and held it out to her. "A gift," he said in his careful English. "For the tall woman who comes from the east." Rebecca looked to her father for guidance, her confusion evident. Thomas nodded curtly, though his own bewilderment was growing. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. "I don't understand," Rebecca said softly, accepting the bracelet with trembling fingers. Stone Bear turned to Thomas, his expression transformed from mere interest to something approaching reverence. "Your daughter is precious beyond measure," he said. "We will take her gladly." Thomas felt relief and guilt warring in his chest. The horses would be his, the family's shame would be removed, but the look of dawning comprehension on Rebecca's face cut through him like a blade. "Father," Rebecca's voice was small, uncertain. "What is happening?" "You're going with them," Thomas said, unable to meet her eyes. "It's for the best." The betrayal hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her hand went to her throat. The turquoise bracelet, forgotten as understanding, crashed over her in waves. "You're trading me away," she whispered. Thomas forced himself to look at her then, seeing his own shame reflected in her winter blue eyes. But he had come too far to retreat now. "They want you," he said roughly, "more than anyone here ever will." Stone Bear stepped between father and daughter, his presence both protective and claiming. He spoke softly to Rebecca in Apache, his tone gentle despite the language barrier. "We go now," he told Thomas. "Before the sun dies." Rebecca stood frozen as her world collapsed around her, the turquoise bracelet heavy in her palm like a shackle made of precious stones. She looked once more at the house where she had been born, at the father who had just sold her future for horses, then followed Stone Bear toward the waiting Apache band. Thomas watched them disappear into the gathering darkness, the turquoise bracelet glinting like a star, as his daughter walked away from everything she had ever known. The Apache horses moved through the darkness with sure-footed confidence, their hooves finding safe passage across terrain that would have challenged experienced settlers. Rebecca rode behind Stone Bear on his mount, her hands gripping the horse's mane as the familiar landscape of her childhood disappeared into shadow. The turquoise bracelet Stone Bear had given her caught moonlight like captured water, its weight on her wrist, a constant reminder of her changed circumstances. She had never owned anything so beautiful, yet its presence felt more like marking than gift, a sign that she now belonged to people whose ways remained completely foreign to her. Stone Bear spoke occasionally to his companions in their native language, his voice carrying the rhythm of a tongue that flowed like water over stones. Rebecca caught none of the meaning, but the tone suggested routine communication, rather than discussion of captives or trade goods. Whatever she represented to these men, it was not what she had feared during those first terrifying moments. The Apache band traveled with the efficiency of people intimately familiar with night movement. They avoided obvious paths, choosing routes that followed natural contours of the land while leaving minimal sign of their passage. Rebecca marveled at their skill despite her fear, recognizing expertise that surpassed anything she had witnessed in the settlement. As dawn approached, they stopped beside a hidden spring, where cottonwood trees provided shelter from both weather and observation. One of the younger Apache warriors produced a leather pouch containing dried meat and what appeared to be ground corn mixed with berries. Stone Bear offered some to Rebecca, his manner respectful rather than commanding. "Eat," he said in English, his pronunciation careful. "Long journey ahead." Rebecca accepted the food hesitantly, expecting flavors that would assault her settler's palate. Instead, she found the mixture surprisingly palatable,
the sweet berries balancing the meat's saltiness in ways that spoke of generations of trail wisdom. Stone Bear settled beside her as the other warriors tended their horses and prepared for the day's continuation. From his pouch, he withdrew another item, a small leather bag decorated with intricate beadwork in patterns that seemed to tell stories through color and design. Medicine pouch, he explained, pressing it into her hands, for protection on the journey between worlds. Rebecca examined the pouch's workmanship, running her fingers over beads that had been sewn with incredible precision. The leather was soft as silk, worked until it felt like fabric rather than hide. Between worlds, she asked. Stone Bear considered his words carefully, searching for English expressions that could convey concepts foreign to her experience. You were one person in the morning, he said finally. Tonight, you will be another.
The journey changes all who make it. What kind of person will I become? Stone Bear's weathered face softened with something that might have been compassion. The person you were meant to be before others told you who you should be. His words carried weight beyond their simple construction, suggesting understanding of her situation that went deeper than surface observation. Rebecca realized that Stone Bear had recognized not just her unusual height, but the shame that surrounded it like a visible aura. My father, she began, then stopped, unsure how to express the tangle of emotions surrounding Thomas's betrayal. Your father fears what he does not understand, Stone Bear said. Fear makes men do things their spirits know are wrong. Will I ever see him again? Stone Bear was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where sunlight was beginning to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. That depends on many things, he said, eventually. On who you become, on what he learns, on whether forgiveness can grow where fear once lived. The medicine pouch felt warm in Rebecca's hands, its weight suggesting contents beyond the physical herbs and stones she assumed it contained. Stone Bear rose and moved toward his horse, signaling that their rest was ending. Why did you take me? Rebecca asked, the question that had burned inside her throughout the night finally finding voice. Stone Bear paused in adjusting his horse's bridle, his movements stilling as if the question required his full attention. We did not take you, he said, turning to face her directly. We received you. There is a difference. Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, the Apache band was mounting up, preparing to continue their journey into territory she had never seen. As she climbed onto Stone Bear's horse once again, Rebecca looked back toward the settlement one last time, seeing only empty landscape where her former life had been. The medicine pouch pressed against her palm, like a promise of protection she did not yet understand, while the turquoise bracelet caught morning light like a beacon, guiding her toward an uncertain future. The Apache camp revealed itself gradually as they descended into a hidden valley where red sandstone cliffs sheltered a collection of traditional dwellings. Smoke rose from cooking fires tended by women whose movements spoke of generations of practice, while children played games that required no common language to understand. Rebecca's arrival caused a stir of interest, but not the fearful reaction she had expected. Stone Bear helped her dismount near the largest dwelling, his hands steady and respectful. An elderly woman emerged from the structure, her silver hair braided with colorful beads that caught the afternoon light. Her face bore the deep lines of advanced age, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who missed nothing of importance. Grandmother Singing Wolf, Stone Bear said in English, clearly for Rebecca's benefit. She is our keeper of old stories. The elderly woman approached Rebecca with slow, measured steps, her gaze taking in every detail of the newcomer's appearance. When she reached Rebecca's full height, Grandmother Singing Wolf's eyes widened with recognition that seemed to transcend mere physical observation. Tall woman who comes from sunrise, the elder said in heavily accented English. We have been waiting for me. Rebecca asked, confusion evident in her voice. Grandmother Singing Wolf gestured toward the cliff face behind the camp, where Rebecca noticed carved figures painted in earth tones across the sandstone surface. The pictographs told stories through images that predated written language, their meanings encoded in symbols that spoke to those who understood their visual vocabulary. "Come," the elder said, leading Rebecca toward the ancient artwork. As they approached the cliff face, the pictographs resolved into clearer detail. Rebecca saw figures representing daily life, hunting scenes, ceremonial gatherings, seasonal celebrations, but her attention was drawn to one particular image that seemed to pulse with significance. A tall female figure stood at the center of a group of smaller people, her height emphasized by artistic perspective that made her tower over the surrounding community. Above her head, symbols suggested divine connection, while at her feet, plants and animals appeared to flourish under her influence. "The prophecy of Tall Woman," Grandmother Singing Wolf explained, her voice carrying the reverence reserved for sacred matters. "She comes from the direction of sunrise, bringing height that touches the sky spirits. Her presence will bring harmony between earth and heaven." Rebecca stared at the ancient image, seeing her own unusual stature reflected in artwork that predated her existence by centuries. The figure in the pictograph stood proudly, her height portrayed as blessing rather than curse, her elevated position suggesting spiritual significance rather than social awkwardness. "How long has this been here?" Rebecca asked. "Since the time of our great-grandmothers' great-grandmothers," the elder replied. "The story says Tall Woman will come when the people need guidance in changing times. When old ways meet new ways, she will help us find the path forward." Stone Bear joined them at the cliff face, his expression serious as he studied the pictographs alongside Rebecca. "Your father did not understand what he was giving away," he said quietly. "To him you were burden. To us you are gift from the spirit world." Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes as the full meaning of the revelation settled over her. Everything she had been taught to see as shameful defect was here portrayed as divine blessing. Her height, which had made her outcast in the settlement, marked her as chosen among these people. "But I don't know anything about being spiritual," she protested. "I'm just tall." Grandmother Singing Wolf smiled with the patience of someone who had spent decades teaching young people about mysteries they could not yet comprehend. "Spiritual power is not something you learn like sewing or cooking," she said. "It is something you discover like water in the desert. It was always there, waiting for you to recognize its presence." The elder touched Rebecca's arm gently, her weathered fingers tracing the turquoise bracelet Stone Bear had given her. "This bracelet was made for Tall Woman," she explained, "crafted by my grandmother's hands according to the vision she received in dreams. We have kept it waiting for you to come and claim what was always yours." Rebecca looked again at the pictograph, seeing herself in the ancient artwork with new understanding. The figure's elevated height connected earth to sky, bridging two realms in ways that shorter people could not achieve. Her unusual stature was not accident or curse, it was purposeful design by forces beyond human comprehension. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked. "Learn who you really are," Grandmother Singing Wolf replied. "The rest will follow." Learning the Apache way of life proved both challenging and liberating for Rebecca. Her days began before dawn with the other women, gathering water from the hidden spring and preparing the morning meal. The work was familiar. Women's tasks remained similar across cultures, but the attitude surrounding these activities felt entirely different. In the settlement, Rebecca had performed domestic duties with the constant awareness that her height made even simple tasks appear awkward. Here the Apache women watched her reach high places with appreciation rather than discomfort, asking her to retrieve items from elevated storage without the embarrassed apologies she had grown accustomed to receiving. Bright Feather, a woman near Rebecca's age with quick hands and a ready smile, took charge of teaching her the Apache language.
They sat together in the shade during the hottest part of each day, working on a large woven blanket that would serve multiple purposes in the coming winter months. "Your fingers learn quickly," Brightfeather observed in careful English, then repeated the same sentiment in Apache, encouraging Rebecca to recognize the patterns of the unfamiliar tongue. The blanket they worked on told a story through its patterns, with geometric designs representing different aspects of tribal life. Brightfeather explained how each section corresponded to a different season, a different ceremony, a different way of understanding the world's interconnected nature. "In your settlement," Brightfeather asked during one of their lessons, "do women's hands tell stories?" Rebecca considered the question while working a particularly complex section of the blanket's border. In Cedar Ridge, women's handwork served practical purposes, mending, cooking, cleaning, but rarely carried the deeper meaning she was discovering in Apache culture. "We make things," she said slowly, searching for words in both languages, "but they are just things." Brightfeather nodded with understanding, rather than judgment. "Here, everything speaks," she explained. "Blankets remember who slept beneath them. Baskets hold the spirits of plants that gave their lives to become useful. Even simple things carry the breath of their makers." The concept challenged Rebecca's understanding of the physical world. In the settlement, objects existed to serve functions. Here they seemed to exist in relationship with their creators and users, holding meaning that transcended mere utility. As her language skills improved, Rebecca began participating in evening gatherings where stories were shared around carefully tended fires. The Apache oral tradition revealed itself as a complex educational system, with tales that taught everything from practical survival skills to profound spiritual concepts. Grandmother Singing Wolf often led these sessions, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent preserving cultural knowledge. Rebecca listened intently, beginning to understand how her own story was woven into the larger tapestry of Apache prophecy and expectation. "Tell us about your sunrise people," one of the younger women requested during a particularly relaxed evening gathering. Rebecca struggled to describe the settlement in terms that would make sense to her Apache audience. How could she explain a society that valued conformity above all else to people who celebrated individual gifts as manifestations of spiritual power? "They build square houses in straight lines," she began, using her improving Apache vocabulary, supplemented with gestures. "They measure time by clocks instead of seasons. They fear what is different." "What did they fear about you?" asked Running Gear, a girl perhaps 15 years old, whose own height suggested she might one day understand Rebecca's experience. "My height made them uncomfortable," Rebecca replied. "They said it was not proper for women." The Apache women exchanged glances that spoke of shared bewilderment at such reasoning. "Height brings you closer to sky spirits," observed Moonshadow. "Height brings you closer to sky spirits," observed Moonshadow, an older woman whose own spiritual responsibilities included weather ceremonies. Why would this be improper? Rebecca realized she had no logical answer to the question.
The settlement's rejection of her height had been so fundamental to her experience that she had never questioned its underlying assumptions. The woven blanket grew larger each day under their combined efforts, its intricate patterns becoming a map of Rebecca's integration into Apache life. She learned to read the symbols that represented different aspects of existence: earth, sky, water, fire, and began to understand how her own unusual height fit into this cosmic ordering. "Your place is here," Brightfeather said one afternoon, indicating Rebecca's section of the blanket where her stitches had created patterns that somehow complemented the overall design despite her initial inexperience. "Between earth patterns and sky patterns, you connect what others cannot reach." Rebecca studied her contribution to the blanket, seeing how her work literally bridged different sections of the design. Without conscious intention, she had created visual connections that brought harmony to potentially disparate elements. "Is this what I'm supposed to do?" she asked. "Connect things?" "You are supposed to be yourself," Brightfeather replied simply. Everything else will follow naturally. The ceremony took place on the night of the harvest moon, when the entire Apache community gathered in the natural amphitheater formed by the surrounding cliffs. Rebecca had been preparing for weeks under grandmother Singing Wolf's careful guidance, learning the sacred songs and understanding the spiritual significance of what was about to occur. The sacred headdress rested on a specially prepared buffalo hide, its eagle feathers and turquoise ornaments catching firelight like captured stars. Grandmother Singing Wolf had spent days preparing the ceremonial piece, adding elements that had been saved for generations in anticipation of this moment. "This headdress has waited for you since my grandmother's time," the elder explained as she made final adjustments to the intricate beadwork. "Each feather was chosen by women who dreamed of your coming. Each stone was blessed by medicine men who saw your face in their visions." Rebecca felt the weight of expectation settling around her like a ceremonial robe. In the settlement, she had been an embarrassment to be hidden. Here she was about to become the focal point of the most important spiritual gathering the tribe had held in decades. Stone Bear approached carrying a bowl of sacred clay mixed with herbs and ground minerals. His role as spiritual leader extended beyond his practical leadership of the band, encompassing responsibilities that connected the physical and spiritual worlds. "Are you ready to receive what has always belonged to you?" he asked in formal Apache, the ritual words carrying weight that transcended their simple meaning. Rebecca nodded, though she felt anything but ready. The past months had transformed her understanding of herself, but she still struggled to believe she was worthy of the reverence these people showed her. The ceremony began with drumming that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, rhythms that matched the heartbeat. Rebecca felt pulsing through her feet as she stood in the ceremonial circle. The Apache community formed concentric rings around her, their faces illuminated by torchlight that made the surrounding cliffs appear to dance. Grandmother Singing Wolf began the formal recitation of the prophecy, her voice carrying across the gathering with the power of absolute belief. She spoke in Apache, but Rebecca now understood enough to follow the essential meaning. "From the direction of sunrise comes the tall woman, she who bridges earth and sky. Her height reaches toward the spirit world, while her feet remain planted in the world of people. Through her, the voices of the ancestors will speak to guide us through times of change." The sacred clay felt cool against Rebecca's skin as Stone Bear painted symbols on her face and arms, each mark carrying spiritual significance that connected her to the ceremonial tradition, stretching back through countless generations. The patterns seemed to transform her features, making her appear both more human and more than human. When Stone Bear placed the sacred headdress on her head, Rebecca felt something shift inside her consciousness. The weight of the feathers and stones was physical, but something else settled over her spirit, a sense of connection to forces larger than individual existence. The gathering fell silent as Rebecca stood wearing the ceremonial regalia, her height emphasized by the headdress, until she seemed to tower over the assembled community like a figure from the ancient pictographs. But instead of the self-conscious discomfort she had always felt about her stature, Rebecca experienced a sense of rightness, as if she had finally found the space she was meant to occupy. Grandmother Singing Wolf stepped forward, carrying a staff carved from sacred wood and decorated with shells, feathers and stones that represented the four directions. This too had been waiting for the prophesied arrival, crafted according to spiritual guidance received in dreams and visions. "With this staff, you will call down blessings from the sky spirits," the elder explained, placing the ceremonial object in Rebecca's hands. "Your height gives you power to reach where others cannot. Your spirit gives you wisdom to use that power for the good of all people." As Rebecca held the staff, she felt energy flowing through the carved wood like water through a riverbed. The sensation was unlike anything she had experienced, a connection to natural forces that seemed to respond to her presence. The assembled Apache began singing, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to call forth responses from the surrounding landscape. Rebecca found herself adding her own voice to the chorus, words coming to her in Apache, though she had never learned the particular song they were singing. Standing in the center of the ceremonial circle, wearing the sacred headdress and holding the staff of spiritual authority, Rebecca finally understood what Stone Bear had meant when he said she would become the person she was meant to be. The tall, awkward girl, who had been traded away like livestock, had transformed into something the Apache recognized as divine manifestation. For the first time in her life, Rebecca felt her height was exactly right. Thomas Whitmore's life began unraveling the morning after the Apache took Rebecca away. He woke to find the horses he had gained through his shameful bargain, standing in his pasture like monuments to his moral failure, their magnificent forms offering no comfort for the emptiness that had settled in his chest. The settlement's reaction to Rebecca's departure was not what Thomas had expected. Instead of relief at the removal of their community's embarrassment, people regarded him with a mixture of horror and disgust that cut deeper than their previous whispers about his daughter's height. "You traded your own flesh and blood," Martha Stevens said when she encountered him at the general store, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who had never faced such desperate circumstances. "What kind of man does such a thing?" Thomas tried to explain the impossible situation Rebecca's presence had created, the way her unusual stature had poisoned every aspect of their family's standing in the community. But his words sounded hollow even to his own ears, practical justifications crumbling under the weight of what he had actually done. The grain storage business that had provided Thomas with modest prosperity began failing as customers found excuses to take their trade elsewhere. Men who had conducted business with him for years now avoided his presence, their discomfort palpable whenever circumstances forced interaction. "I can't, in good conscience, continue our arrangement," Jim Patterson told him when Thomas tried to renew their annual contract. "My wife would never forgive me for dealing with a man who'd sell his own daughter." Thomas's financial situation deteriorated rapidly as one contract after another was terminated or allowed to expire without renewal. The horses he had gained from the trade remained healthy and strong, but he could find no buyers willing to purchase animals that represented such a morally compromised transaction. Alone in his house each evening, Thomas found himself confronting reminders of Rebecca's presence everywhere he looked. Her bedroom remained exactly as she had left it, her few possessions arranged on surfaces that now seemed to accuse him with their silence. On the windowsill beside her bed sat a small cloth doll that Sarah had sewn for Rebecca's 6th birthday. The toy was worn from years of handling, its fabric faded, but its stitched features still recognizable. Thomas picked up the doll with trembling hands, remembering how Rebecca had carried it everywhere during her early childhood, finding comfort in its familiar presence. The doll seemed to weight more than its simple construction should allow, as if it had absorbed some essence of the daughter he had betrayed. Thomas pressed it against his chest and felt tears he had been suppressing since the night of the trade finally beginning to flow. "What have I done, Maggie?" he whispered to his dead wife's memory, using Rebecca's doll as a focal point for grief he could no longer contain. What kind of monster trades away his own child? Sleep became elusive as guilt gnawed at Thomas's conscience during the dark hours when rational justifications lost their power to comfort him. He lay awake remembering every moment of Rebecca's childhood, every instance when her unusual height had brought her pain, and wondering if his protection might have made a difference. The settlement's isolation of Thomas grew more complete with each passing week. Invitations to social gatherings ceased arriving. His pew at church remained empty, as he found himself unable to face the judgment in his neighbor's eyes. Even routine transactions at the post office and bank became exercises in social navigation, with people timing their visits to avoid encounters with the man who had committed an unforgivable act. Mayor Caldwell summoned Thomas to a private meeting in his office, the same man who had once suggested that Rebecca's presence was affecting the community's reputation. "The irony is not lost on me," Caldwell said without preamble, his tone cold with disapproval. "We worried that your daughter's situation reflected poorly on our settlement, Now your actions have created a scandal that makes her height seem trivial by comparison. Thomas sat in silence, unable to defend choices that appeared increasingly indefensible with each passing day. I've had inquiries from other settlements, Caldwell continued. Word travels fast about a man who would trade his daughter like livestock. Your presence here has become more damaging to our reputation than Rebecca's ever was. The suggestion that Thomas consider relocating hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. Thomas understood that his standing in Cedar Ridge was beyond repair, that the community which had once embraced him as a respectable citizen now viewed him as a pariah whose continued presence served only as a reminder of moral failure. Returning home to his empty house, Thomas sat holding Rebecca's childhood doll and wondering if there was any path back from the choice he had made. The news reached Thomas through Jacob Morrison, a traveling merchant who made regular circuits between settlements and occasionally carried information along with his trade goods. Morrison arrived at Thomas's property on a cold morning in late autumn, his wagon loaded with winter supplies and his expression troubled. "I bring word about your daughter," Morrison said without preamble, clearly uncomfortable with his role as messenger. Thomas felt his heart stop, then resume beating with painful intensity. For months, he had tried to avoid thinking about Rebecca's fate, telling himself that whatever had happened to her was beyond his control or responsibility. "What news?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. Morrison pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, a crude map drawn by someone with limited artistic skills but clear geographical knowledge. Trade routes were marked in pencil, with settlements indicated by small squares and natural landmarks sketched in rough approximation. "Apache territory," Morrison explained, pointing to an area marked with symbols Thomas didn't recognize. "About 3 days hard riding southeast of here. The band that took your daughter has a camp in a hidden valley near the Red Cliffs." Thomas studied the map, trying to comprehend the distance that separated him from Rebecca. 3 days hard riding might as well have been 3 months for a man whose social isolation had grown so complete that even purchasing supplies required careful timing to avoid hostile encounters. "How do you know this?" Thomas asked. "Other Apache." "The bands," Morrison replied. "They speak of something unusual happening with Stone Bear's people. A white woman has joined them, but not as captive. They say she's become some kind of spiritual leader." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. He had imagined Rebecca suffering in captivity, reduced to the status of slave, or worse. The possibility that she might have found not just acceptance but elevation among the Apache had never occurred to him. "Spiritual leader," Thomas repeated, the concept seeming impossible when applied to the awkward girl he had traded away. "The stories vary," Morrison said carefully, "but they all mention her unusual height. The Apache apparently see it as sign of divine favor rather than defect." Thomas sank onto his porch steps, the map trembling in his hands as the full implications of Morrison's news settled over him. Rebecca wasn't just surviving among the Apache, she was thriving in ways that her life in the settlement had never allowed. "They say she performs ceremonies," Morrison continued, his voice growing more hesitant. "Calls down rain, blesses hunting parties, serves as intermediary between their people and the spirit world." Each detail felt like another nail in the coffin of Thomas's assumptions about what he had done to his daughter. He had convinced himself that trading her to the Apache was cruel but necessary, a harsh choice that at least removed her from a situation where she could never find happiness. Instead, it appeared he had stolen her from her true destiny and delayed her discovery of it by 17 years. "Is she?" Thomas struggled to form the question. "Does she seem content?" Morrison nodded slowly. "The Apache I spoke with described her as radiant. Said her presence has brought harmony to their band in ways they hadn't experienced for generations." Thomas folded the map carefully, his hands shaking with emotions he couldn't name. The paper felt heavier than its simple construction warranted, weighted with implications that challenged everything he thought he understood about his actions. "There's something else," Morrison said reluctantly. The Apache have been asking about her origins. They want to understand where she came from, what circumstances led to her being available for trade. What did you tell them? Nothing specific, Morrison replied. But word has a way of traveling in these territories. Eventually they'll learn the full story. Thomas understood the warning implicit in Morrison's words. The Apache would eventually discover that Rebecca hadn't been given willingly to fulfill some spiritual calling, but had been traded away by a father who saw her as burden rather than blessing. Would they? Thomas began, then stopped, afraid to voice the question that burned in his mind. Would they what? Would they allow a man to see his daughter, to speak with her? Morrison considered the question carefully, his weathered face reflecting the complexity of frontier politics and Apache customs. That would depend on many things, he said finally. On their traditions regarding family relationships, on the daughter's wishes, on whether they view the father as having acted honorably. Thomas knew he had not acted honorably, but the knowledge that Rebecca was alive and apparently flourishing kindled something in his chest that he hadn't felt since the night of the trade. Hope, fragile but persistent, that some form of redemption might still be possible. Swift-Hawk had been watching Rebecca for weeks before he found the courage to approach her with more than casual conversation. As one of the band's most skilled warriors, a man whose hunting prowess fed the community and whose bravery in battle had earned respect throughout Apache territory, he was accustomed to confidence in all aspects of life. But Rebecca's elevated spiritual status made her seem untouchable, a divine figure rather than a woman who might welcome romantic attention. The opportunity finally came during the evening of the autumn equinox ceremony, when Rebecca's role as spiritual intermediary had been completed, and she sat quietly near the dying ceremonial fire. The sacred headdress rested on its special stand, and she wore simple clothing that made her seem more approachable, though her height still set her apart from everyone around her. Swift-Hawk carried with him an eagle feather he had earned during a vision quest the previous spring, a token of spiritual significance that represented courage, wisdom, and connection to the sky spirits. Among his people, offering such a feather to a woman indicated serious romantic intention, a gesture that went beyond mere attraction to suggest deep respect for her spiritual nature. "Tall woman who touches sky," he said formally, using the ceremonial name Rebecca had been given during her recognition ceremony. "May I speak with you?" Rebecca looked up from the fire, her eyes reflecting flames that seemed to dance within a light. The months among the Apache had transformed her in ways that went beyond learning their language and customs. She moved with grace that came from finally understanding her place in the world, spoke with authority that emerged from being valued rather than tolerated. "Of course, Swift-Hawk," she replied in fluent Apache, her accent still carrying traces of her English origins, but her grammar now flawless. "Please sit." Swift-Hawk settled beside her on the woven mat, maintaining respectful distance while positioning himself where conversation could flow naturally. The eagle feather lay across his palm, its barred pattern catching firelight in ways that seemed to make it glow. "I have watched you since your arrival," he began carefully, "seen how you have grown into the prophecies our grandmothers carried in their hearts. You have become everything the old stories promised, and more." Rebecca felt heat rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. In the settlement, no man had ever spoken to her with such genuine admiration, such complete acceptance of who she was, rather than disappointment in who she wasn't. "The prophecies guided me here," she said, "but the people made me welcome, especially you." Swift-Hawk smiled, his weathered features softening with pleasure at her acknowledgement. He was perhaps 25 years old, with the lean strength that came from a life spent hunting and riding across challenging terrain. His face bore the traditional tattoos that marked his warrior status, but his eyes held gentleness that balanced his reputation for fierceness in battle. "I have something for you," he said, extending the eagle feather toward her. "A gift that carries my intentions as well as my respect."
Rebecca accepted the feather with hands that trembled slightly, understanding the significance of what Swift Hawk was offering. The eagle feather represented more than romantic interest. It was recognition of her spiritual authority, combined with personal attraction that honored both aspects of her identity. "This is beautiful," she said, examining the feather's perfect structure, "and meaningful beyond its beauty." "As are you," Swift Hawk replied simply. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned lower, each lost in thoughts about possibilities that neither had dared consider until this moment. Rebecca had assumed her role as spiritual leader would preclude ordinary human relationships, while Swift Hawk had wondered whether a woman of such elevated status would consider a warrior worthy of her attention. "In my former life," Rebecca said eventually, "no man looked at me the way you do." "How did they look at you?" "Like I was broken. Like my height was punishment rather than gift." Swift Hawk shook his head with the incomprehension of someone raised in a culture that celebrated rather than feared unusual traits. "Your height connects earth to sky," he said. "How could that be anything but blessing?" Rebecca turned the eagle feather in her hands, feeling its spiritual weight alongside the promise it represented. "Would the people accept such a union?" she asked. "A spiritual leader married to a warrior. Our greatest medicine woman, Grandmother Singing Wolf, was married to Chief Running Bear for 40 years, Swift Hawk replied. "Spiritual power and earthly love need not be enemies." The fire crackled softly between them as Rebecca considered the future. Swift Hawk was offering a life where her spiritual role would be balanced by human companionship, where her unusual height would be celebrated in both sacred ceremonies and intimate moments. Thomas's hands shook as he closed the worn Bible that had belonged to his father. The morning light streaming through his kitchen window illuminated dust motes that danced like spirits, reminding him of how empty his house and his light danced like spirits, reminding him of how empty his house had become since Rebecca's departure. He had spent the night reading scripture, searching for guidance about the journey he was taking. The words that kept returning to him came from him. "And he arose and came to his father." He came to his father, but when he was yet a great way off, his father greatly far off. His father saw him and had compassion. When he was yet a great way off, his father still was not the father in that father. And Sancho is not father, and father, and father. He was the one who needed forgiveness, the one who did forgiveness, the one who would forgive, the one who committed those things, the one who's forgiven for us, the one who's forgiven us, the one who chose, which is when you want, and then it's the one you do, and the works, the one who's looked at home.
The decision to undertake the journey to Apache territory had crystallized slowly over the weeks since Jacob Morrison's visit. Each day of isolation in Cedar Ridge reinforced the reality that his old life was beyond salvage. The settlement that had once been his home now treated him like a ghost, present but unwelcome, tolerated only because complete banishment would require effort no one wanted to expend. Thomas packed methodically, choosing items for survival rather than comfort. The journey Morrison had described would test every skill he possessed, requiring him to navigate territory he had never seen while avoiding the various dangers that made frontier travel hazardous for solitary travelers. The Bible went into his saddlebags first, its familiar weight providing comfort, even though its words had begun to feel like accusations rather than solace. He added dried provisions, ammunition, basic medical supplies, and the few tools that might prove essential for wilderness survival. As he prepared his mount, one of the horses he had gained through trading Rebecca, Thomas felt the irony of using his daughter's price to finance his journey toward potential reconciliation. The animal was strong and well-trained, capable of covering the distance Morrison had described, but every mile would serve as reminder of the transaction that had made the trip necessary. The morning of his departure dawned clear and cold autumn air, carrying the promise of winter's approach. Thomas stood in his empty kitchen one final time, looking around at the remnants of a life that had disintegrated through his own moral failure. On the table lay the crude map Morrison had drawn, its penciled lines representing the path toward either redemption or final confirmation of his damnation. The Apache territory seemed impossibly distant, a destination that existed beyond the boundaries of his known world. Thomas mounted his horse and rode away from Cedar Ridge without looking back, understanding that he might never return to the settlement that had been his home for 20 years. The possibility didn't distress him as much as it should have. There was nothing left there worth preserving. The first day's travel took him through familiar countryside, past farms and ranches where he had conducted business in better times. Some of the landowners watched his passage with curiosity, others with the careful neutrality of people who preferred to avoid association with his reputation. By evening he had reached the edge of his familiar territory, camping in a grove of cottonwoods beside a stream that marked the boundary between civilization and the unknown. The night sounds of the wilderness surrounded him, owl calls, rustling leaves, the distant howl of coyotes that reminded him how far he was from human protection. Reading from his Bible by firelight, Thomas found himself drawn to passages about redemption and forgiveness, searching for hope in verses that seemed to mock his situation rather than comfort it. The words felt hollow against the magnitude of what he had done, inadequate to address the weight of betraying a daughter who had depended on his protection. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams where Rebecca appeared as he remembered her, tall, awkward, desperate for acceptance, and as Morrison had described her, radiant, powerful, transformed into something he could barely recognize. In some dreams, she welcomed him with forgiveness. In others, she turned away with the cold dignity of someone who had moved beyond the need for her father's approval. Morning brought frost that made his breath visible in the cold air, a reminder that winter would complicate his journey if he failed to reach Apache territory before severe weather made travel impossible. Thomas broke camp efficiently, his movements guided by determination that felt like the first genuine emotion he had experienced since the night of Rebecca's trade. The path ahead led into country he had never seen, toward a daughter he had lost through his own moral cowardice, carrying hope that felt both essential and possibly futile. Thomas appeared at the edge of the Apache camp, like an apparition from Rebecca's past, his horse lathered with sweat, and his clothes bearing the dust of 3 days' hard travel. She was tending the sacred fire when one of the young warriors brought news of a white man requesting audience with the spiritual leader known as Tall Woman Who Touches Sky. Rebecca felt her world tilt on its axis as understanding crashed over her. Only one white man would have reason to seek her in Apache territory. Only one person from her former life who would dare venture into hostile country to find her. "He says he is your father," the warrior reported, his tone carefully neutral. "Stone Bear has agreed to meet with him, but the decision of whether to grant him access to you remains yours." Rebecca's hands trembled as she added sage to the ceremonial fire, watching the aromatic smoke spiral upward toward the sky. Spirit she now served, the silver locket she wore beneath her Apache clothing, seemed to grow heavier against her chest, the only possession from her former life that she had kept, containing a tiny portrait of her mother. "Where is he now?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "At the camp's edge, under guard. Stone Bear waits for your instructions." Rebecca rose from beside the fire, her height emphasizing the authority she had grown into during her months among the Apache. The sacred staff Stone Bear had carved for her ceremonies leaned against a nearby rock, its surface worn smooth by her daily handling. "Tell Stone Bear I will see him," she said finally, "but not alone. I want you and Swift Hawk present as witnesses." The young warrior nodded and departed, leaving Rebecca alone with emotions she had thought buried beneath her new identity. For months, she had been the prophesied tall woman, a spiritual figure whose elevated stature connected earth and sky. Now she faced returning to being simply Rebecca Whitmore, the daughter a desperate father had traded away like livestock. Thomas stood at the designated meeting place, looking smaller than Rebecca remembered, his shoulders bowed by weight that seemed spiritual rather than physical.
The confident man who had dominated her childhood had been replaced by someone who appeared uncertain, diminished by experiences she could only imagine. Stone Bear flanked Thomas on one side, while Swift Hawk took position on the other, their presence both protective and symbolic. Thomas was being granted audience with their spiritual leader, but he remained under careful watch by warriors whose loyalty lay entirely with Rebecca. The moment their eyes met, Rebecca felt years of carefully constructed emotional barriers threatening to crumble. Thomas looked older, weathered by guilt and isolation in ways that went beyond the natural passage of time. But more than that, he looked afraid, not of the Apache warriors surrounding him, but of what he might see in his daughter's eyes. "Rebecca," Thomas said, his voice cracking with emotion he had clearly struggled to contain during the journey to find her. "I am called Tall Woman Who Touches Sky," Rebecca replied in Apache, then repeated the same words in English. The formal response created distance she needed to maintain her composure. Thomas flinched as if struck, understanding that her correction went beyond simple preference to represent fundamental transformation he had not anticipated. "You look," he began, then stopped, clearly struggling to find words adequate to describe what he was seeing. Rebecca stood tall in her Apache clothing, her hair braided with beads and feathers that marked her spiritual status. The awkward girl who had hunched her shoulders in embarrassment had been replaced by a woman who carried her height like a crown, whose presence commanded respect rather than pity. "Different?" Rebecca suggested, her tone carefully neutral. "Radiant," Thomas said quietly. "You look radiant." The silver locket felt warm against Rebecca's skin as memories of her mother flooded back. Sarah's gentle hands braiding her hair, her mother's voice insisting that height was gift, rather than curse, the love that had shielded Rebecca from the world's cruelty until death stole her protector away. "Why are you here?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Thomas looked around at the Apache camp, taking in the evidence of her integration into a community that celebrated rather than rejected her unusual stature.
His eyes lingered on the sacred staff, the ceremonial clothing, the deference shown her by warriors whose respect had clearly been earned rather than inherited. "I came to ask forgiveness," Thomas said simply, "for what I did, for what I failed to do, for the years I wasted seeing you as burden instead of blessing." The words hung between them like smoke from the sacred fire, carrying weight that transcended their simple construction. Stone Bear granted them privacy in his own dwelling, understanding that some conversations required space free from observers and witnesses. Rebecca entered the circular structure with measured steps, her Apache clothing rustling softly as she settled onto woven mats that had hosted countless important discussions over the years. Thomas sat across from her, his weathered hands holding a folded paper that trembled slightly with the nervous energy he was trying to control. The space between them seemed vast, despite the dwelling's modest size, filled with months of separation and the weight of betrayal that had driven them apart. "I wrote this during the journey here," Thomas said, extending the paper toward Rebecca. "Everything I should have said months ago, everything I failed to understand until it was too late." Rebecca accepted the letter with hands that remained steady despite the turmoil in her chest. The paper was ordinary, torn from a ledger book Thomas had carried in his saddlebags, but the words written in his careful script carried weight that made her fingers tremble as she unfolded it. "My dearest daughter," the letter began, and Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes before she had read beyond the salutation. Thomas had never called her dearest anything, had rarely expressed affection in words rather than grudging obligation. "I write these words knowing they cannot undo the harm I have caused, cannot restore what my cowardice stole from both of us. But perhaps they can serve as honest accounting of a father's failures, and maybe, if mercy exists in your heart as foundation for forgiveness I do not deserve but desperately need." Rebecca paused in her reading, looking up at Thomas, who sat with his head bowed, as if in prayer. His presence in the Apache camp still felt surreal. This man who had dominated her childhood now, appearing small and fragile in the face of consequences he had never anticipated. "I was wrong about everything," she read aloud, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "Wrong about your height being curse instead of blessing. Wrong about the settlement's opinions mattering more than my daughter's happiness. Wrong about thinking I could trade away my own flesh and blood and somehow remain a man worthy of respect." Thomas's shoulders shook with emotion he could no longer contain. Rebecca had never seen her father cry, had grown up believing him incapable of the vulnerability tears represented. "The settlement treats me as pariah now," the letter continued, "and they are right to do so. I betrayed the most sacred trust a father can hold, sacrificing my daughter's welfare for my own reputation. I discovered too late that reputation built on such foundation crumbles into dust, leaving nothing but shame in its wake." Rebecca set the letter aside temporarily, overwhelmed by the raw honesty Thomas had committed to paper. This was not the defensive, self-justifying man who had argued with her mother about Rebecca's future. This was someone who had been broken by his own choices and rebuilt into something capable of genuine remorse. "I learned about your new life from Jacob Morrison," she read when she felt ready to continue. "He spoke of your transformation, your elevation to spiritual leadership among people who see divine blessing where I saw only defect. I wept when I heard those words, Rebecca. Wept for the years I wasted failing to see what the Apache recognized immediately." Thomas lifted his head, meeting Rebecca's eyes directly for the first time since entering the dwelling. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I came here to witness what you've become, to see the woman my blindness prevented me from recognizing when you lived under my roof. You are magnificent, Rebecca. Everything your mother said you would become, everything I was too small-minded to imagine." Rebecca folded the letter carefully, her movements deliberate as she processed words that reframed her understanding of Thomas's journey to find her. This was not the same man who had traded her away. This was someone who had been transformed by consequences, educated by loss into recognizing value he had failed to appreciate when it lived within his reach. "You caused me great pain," Rebecca said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun flowing down her cheeks. "I know, you made me feel worthless, unwanted, ashamed of what I cannot change about myself. I know, you traded me away like I was damaged goods that had become too expensive to maintain." Thomas nodded, accepting each accusation as deserved condemnation of choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but appeared monstrous in retrospect. "And yet," Rebecca continued, "your betrayal led me to people who helped me discover my true worth. Your rejection forced me to find acceptance in places I never would have looked. Your cruelty somehow became the path to my salvation." The wedding dress lay spread across grandmother singing Wolf's Lap like captured moonlight, its white deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories of love, commitment, and spiritual union. Each bead had been placed according to patterns passed down through generations, creating designs that honored both tradition and the unique circumstances of Rebecca's marriage to Swift Hawk. "Every Apache bride wears the symbols of her husband's clan," the elder explained as she made final adjustments to the garment's ceremonial elements. "But you will also wear symbols of your spiritual calling, marking you as bride who brings divine blessing to her union." Rebecca touched the dress's soft leather with reverent fingers, understanding that wearing it would represent more than marriage. It would signify the complete integration into Apache life, her final transformation from the rejected daughter of a frontier settler into a woman whose identity was rooted in acceptance rather than shame. The choice she faced went beyond personal happiness to encompass questions of loyalty, forgiveness, and the nature of belonging. Thomas's presence in the camp had forced her to confront the possibility of reconciliation with her past, while Swift Hawk's patient love offered a future where her height would always be celebrated rather than tolerated. "The spirits have given you an unusual test," Grandmother Singing Wolf observed, her ancient eyes studying Rebecca with the penetrating insight that came from decades of guiding young people through life's difficult transitions. "Your father seeks forgiveness at the moment when you must choose your future. The timing is not coincidence." Rebecca had spent the 3 days since Thomas's arrival in contemplation, seeking guidance through the spiritual practices she had learned among the Apache. She had fasted, prayed, consulted the sacred pictographs that had first revealed her destiny, but clarity remained elusive. "What does your heart tell you?" the elder asked. "My heart is divided," Rebecca admitted. "Part of me wants to punish my father for the pain he caused, to let him live with the consequences of his choices. But another part recognizes that his suffering has taught him truths he was blind to before." Swift Hawk entered the dwelling with the quiet grace that marked all his movements, his presence bringing warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning at the structure's center. He carried his own ceremonial clothing, the regalia of a warrior preparing for the most important commitment of his life. "Have you reached a decision?" he asked gently, settling beside Rebecca with the comfortable intimacy of two people who had shared their deepest thoughts and dreams. "I believe so," Rebecca replied, though uncertainty still colored her voice. "But I wanted to speak with both of you before announcing it to the camp." Grandmother Singing Wolf and Swift Hawk waited patiently, understanding that Rebecca's choice would affect not just her personal happiness, but the spiritual well-being of their entire community. As their prophesied bridge between earth and sky, her decisions carried weight beyond individual preference. "I will marry Swift Hawk," Rebecca said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke the words aloud. "I will wear this dress and speak the vows that will make me his wife and full member of this band forever." Swift Hawk's face brightened with joy, but he remained silent, sensing that Rebecca had more to say. "And I will forgive my father," she continued, "not because he deserves forgiveness, but because carrying anger poisons the spirit of the one who holds it. The Apache taught me that height connects earth to sky, but I have learned that forgiveness connects pain to healing." Grandmother Singing Wolf nodded with approval that spoke of spiritual wisdom rather than mere sentiment. "Forgiveness does not mean forgetting," the elder said. "It means choosing growth over stagnation, choosing to become larger than the harm that was done to you." Swift Hawk took Rebecca's hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt like promise and protection combined. "Your father may witness our wedding if you wish," he said, "not as honored guest, but as man learning what it means to see his daughter valued as she deserves." Rebecca looked down at the wedding dress, imagining herself wearing it before the assembled Apache community, while Thomas watched from whatever position his presence would be granted. The image felt right in ways that surprised her, not because she craved his approval, but because his witness would complete the circle of her transformation. "He will see me as I truly am," she said quietly. "Not the burden he traded away, but the woman I was always meant to become. Perhaps that sight will teach him something about recognizing value before it's lost." The wedding dress seemed to glow in the firelight, its beadwork catching and reflecting illumination like stars scattered across white sky. The blessing ceremony took place at dawn, when the first light touched the red cliffs surrounding the Apache camp with colors that seemed to bridge the earthly and divine realms. Rebecca stood in the ceremonial circle, wearing the white deerskin wedding dress, her height emphasized by the sacred headdress that caught the morning sun like a crown of fire and feathers. Thomas watched from the edge of the gathering, positioned where tradition dictated honored witnesses should stand, though his presence carried the weight of complicated history rather than simple celebration. Stone Bear had granted him this place after Rebecca requested it, understanding that forgiveness required acknowledgement of past harm alongside hope for future healing. Swift Hawk approached from the east, following the ancient path that symbolized new beginnings and the promise of light emerging from darkness. His ceremonial clothing bore the symbols of his warrior status, but also new beadwork that marked him as husband to the prophesied tall woman. The eagle feather he had given Rebecca now adorned his hair, returned to him as sign of her acceptance of his proposal. Grandmother Singing Wolf began the ceremony with words that had blessed Apache unions for countless generations, but she adapted the ancient language to acknowledge the unique spiritual significance of this particular marriage. "Today we witness the joining of earth and sky," she announced, her voice carrying across the assembled community with the authority of absolute belief. Swift Hawk, who runs with the wind across our hunting grounds, takes as wife the tall woman whose height touches the realm of spirits. Rebecca felt transformation occurring within her as the ceremony progressed, not the dramatic spiritual awakening she had experienced during her recognition as spiritual leader, but a quieter settling into the fullness of her identity. She was simultaneously the awkward girl who had been rejected by her birth community, the prophesied figure who had found her calling among the Apache, and now the woman choosing love that honored rather than diminished her unusual gifts. The blessing of the union required both bride and groom to speak vows that connected their personal commitment to their responsibilities toward the broader community. Swift Hawk spoke first, his words carrying the weight of warrior's oath as well as lover's promise. "I take tall woman who touches sky as wife," he declared, his voice steady despite the emotion that colored his features. "I pledge to protect her body and honor her spirit. I promise to see her height as blessing rather than burden, to celebrate the gifts that make her bridge between worlds." Rebecca's response drew from both Apache tradition and her own understanding of what marriage should represent when both partners brought spiritual calling to their union. "I take Swift Hawk as husband," she said, her voice carrying across the gathering with clarity that left no doubt about her conviction. "I pledge to walk beside him as equal partner, to bring the wisdom of sky spirits to our earthly life together. I promise to love him with the same courage he has shown in accepting a wife who towers above convention." Stone Bear stepped forward carrying a blanket woven specifically for this ceremony, its patterns incorporating symbols from both Swift Hawk's warrior achievements and Rebecca's spiritual recognition. The blanket would serve practical purpose in their shared dwelling, but it also represented the way individual identities could combine to create something larger than either could achieve alone. As Stone Bear wrapped the ceremonial blanket around both bride and groom, Thomas felt tears flowing down his cheeks with freedom he had not allowed himself since Sarah's death. He was witnessing his daughter's wedding, but more than that, he was seeing the completion of her transformation into a woman who commanded respect from an entire community. The painting ceremony followed, with Grandmother Singing Wolf creating a family portrait that would hang in the dwelling Swift Hawk and Rebecca would share. Unlike the formal studio photographs common in settlements, this artwork captured spiritual essence as well as physical appearance. Rebecca appeared tall and radiant, her height portrayed as connection to divine realms rather than social awkwardness. Swift Hawk stood beside her, with pride that spoke of a man who had won the heart of someone extraordinary. "This painting will remind you both of the moment when two lives became one," Grandmother Singing Wolf explained as she added final details to the ceremonial artwork. "When children come to you, they will see how their parents looked on the day love conquered all obstacles to their union." Thomas understood that his place in this family portrait would always be complicated, that his role in Rebecca's story was that of the father who had failed her, rather than the one who had nurtured her transformation. But watching her radiant happiness as she embraced her new husband, he felt something approaching peace, with the knowledge that his betrayal had somehow led to her finding the life she was meant to live. The community celebrated long into the day, but Thomas prepared for departure as afternoon shadows began lengthening toward evening. The ceremonial staff rested in Rebecca's hands with the familiar weight of authority and responsibility she had grown to cherish during her months
as spiritual leader of the Apache band. Carved from sacred wood and decorated with symbols representing the four directions, the staff had become extension of her identity, a physical manifestation of her role as bridge between earthly and divine realms. 2 years had passed since her wedding to Swift Hawk, 2 years of leading ceremonies, blessing hunting parties, and serving as interpreter of spiritual signs for a community that had embraced her as completely as her birth settlement had rejected her. The awkward girl who had once hunched her shoulders in embarrassment had evolved into a woman whose height commanded reverence, whose presence brought harmony to conflicts and wisdom to difficult decisions. Standing before the sacred fire on this crisp autumn morning, Rebecca prepared to lead the seasonal ceremony that would ask the spirit's blessing on the coming winter. The gathered Apache watched with the respectful attention they always showed during her spiritual work, their faces reflecting complete confidence in her ability to intercede on their behalf with forces beyond human understanding. Sky spirits who guide the wind, Rebecca began, raising the ceremonial staff toward the dawn light that painted the red cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. Earth spirits who hold the roots of all growing things, we ask your protection through the season of rest, your promise that spring will return to wake the sleeping land. The ritual words came to her in fluent Apache, the language that had become as natural as English, perhaps more so. She had not spoken her birth tongue in months, having no need for words that belonged to a word she had left behind. So quickly as a snake sheds outgrown the skin,
Swift Hawk stood among the gathered warriors, his face bright with pride, as he watched his wife perform duties that honored both her spiritual calling and their marriage. Their union had become model for the community, proof that spiritual authority and earthly love could strengthen rather than compete with each other. The ceremony proceeded through its ancient phases, each movement and spoken word carrying significance that connected the present moment to countless generations of Apache tradition. Rebecca felt the familiar sensation of spiritual energy flowing through the carved staff, as if the wood itself contained power that responded to her elevated connection to the sky realm. When the formal ritual concluded, she remained beside the sacred fire as the community dispersed to begin their daily activities. These quiet moments after ceremonies had become precious to her, times when she could feel most clearly the transformation that had brought her from shame to honor, from rejection to reverence. Grandmother Singing Wolf approached with the slow, careful steps that marked her advancing age, but her eyes remained sharp, with the intelligence that had made her keeper of tribal wisdom for over 6 decades. The spirits speak clearly through you, the elder observed, settling beside Rebecca on the woven mats that surrounded the ceremonial fire. Your height gives you power to reach where others cannot, but your heart gives you wisdom to use that power for good. Rebecca touched the turquoise bracelet that still adorned her wrist, the same ornament Stone Bear had given her during that first terrifying night when her old life ended and her new one began. The bracelet had come to symbolize more than spiritual recognition. It represented the moment when someone first saw her unusual stature as blessing rather than burden. Sometimes I think about my father, Rebecca admitted, a confession she rarely voiced even to those closest to her. Wonder if he has learned to see value in things he once rejected. What do you hope he has learned? Grandmother Singing Wolf asked. Rebecca considered the question while watching smoke from the sacred fire spiral upward toward the sky spirits she served. The answer, when it came to her, felt like truth that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I hope he has learned that worth is not determined by how well someone fits into narrow spaces, she said. That difference can be divine gift rather than social curse. That a father's first duty is to help his children discover their true nature, not force them to become what others expect. The ceremonial staff caught morning light along its carved surface, each symbol seeming to glow within a fire. Rebecca understood that this staff would one day pass to another spiritual leader, but for now it remained hers to wield, a tangible reminder of the calling she had discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. As the sun climbed higher above the red cliffs, Rebecca rose to begin another day of leading a people who had given her everything her birth family had failed to provide: acceptance, purpose, and the knowledge that being different was not something to overcome, but something to celebrate.